I'm Harper Lawson, 33, and the night my family decided I owed my sister's wedding, my father didn't raise his voice so much as he sharpened it. It slid across the table the way a chilled knife cuts butter. Candlelight trembled against the silver as he told me I would cover every last bill while Brooke sat there smiling like she'd already signed the receipt. The number they named wasn't a suggestion. It was a command dressed in linen and crystal, $275,000 within a month. My mother's hand rested on the table, the pale shimmer of her bracelet catching the light, as if the stones themselves agreed with her nod. I stared at the neatly printed invoice beside the salt cellar and understood they weren't asking for help. They were collecting a debt they believed existed. I remember noticing the quiet, first the hush under the clink of glass, the practiced pauses they used when they wanted me to obey. Somewhere in the back of my mind, a blue folder I hadn't opened in years shifted like a door in a draft. By dessert, I knew the landscape of my life was about to change whether they realized it or not. Before I go any further, tell me where you're listening from in the comments, and if you've ever had to stand your ground with family tap, like, and subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. I grew up in a small colonial with a tidy yard and a hand-painted mailbox where we were taught to say thank you even when dinner was late and to show up even when it was inconvenient. My mother kept a chart on the fridge with chores in careful script. My father kept a schedule that never left room for questions. I learned early that being useful was the same as being loved, and that the easiest way to keep peace at the table was to carry more than my share without remark. By the time I finished high school, I could balance a checkbook, sew a hem, and carry a conversation through 3 courses without mentioning myself once. Those habits followed me into the city where money moved in numbers with too many zeros, and office towers kept their own weather. Larkspur Capital was not built for apologies. It was built for results. I started as an analyst working past midnight under lights that hummed counting risk and reward, while the subway rattled beneath my apartment like distant thunder. The first time I flew business class for work, I kept the menu as a joke, half embarrassed to admit the legroom felt like a revelation. My days were made of early trains and late dinners of pitch books and red-eye flights, while back in the suburbs my parents learned the names of florists and club managers who mattered. The two worlds sat side by side like mismatched plates. Mine practical and heavy, theirs polished and careful, until they began using my world to prop up theirs. Brooke was always sunlight at the table, even when the weather didn't warrant it. My parents called her a free spirit, by which they meant rules were a suggestion and bills were a story someone else should tell. There was the year she needed time to find herself, and the year she briefly opened a boutique that sold candles and silk scarves at prices that made you smile politely and put the item back. There were apartments with views and classes that might lead to degrees someday, and there was always a reason my contribution made the difference between her promise and her disappointment. In our parents' retelling, I was the sister good with numbers, as if that skill existed independent of the hours it took to earn it. Brooke was the artist, as if artistry required an audience covered in gold. I don't remember when the gratitude turned into expectation. Only the feeling of it. The small change in air when a request arrives shaped like a fact. Checks were no longer gifts, they were routines. My father liked to say that families invest in one another, and my mother liked to add that a sister's big day happens only once, which was true each time we reached for a new reason. It took years for me to realize how neatly I'd been trained, how quickly I offered solutions, how rarely anyone asked what those solutions cost me. The city paid me well, and I let my parents measure my worth in dollar signs because it kept the room quiet. It is a strange thing to be useful and invisible at the same time. That night at the long table, usefulness had a total and a due date. The invoice sat between the centerpiece roses and my water glass, a line-item parade of glittering choices venue deposits, floral refreshes a custom dress whose price would cover a year of rent for a teacher in the next town over. My mother's voice stayed gentle, almost musical, when she said, "You've done so well." Harper and my father's gaze kept the kind of even pressure that moves stubborn objects. Brooke scrolled through honeymoon photos on her phone and did not look at me at all. I folded my napkin the way I always do when I'm buying time, and in that small pause, something finally clicked a tooth, finding its cog. I wasn't deciding whether to pay for a wedding. I was deciding whether to keep letting them tell me who I was. I asked for a day which in our family was the same as refusing, and the room cooled by a few degrees I don't think anyone else felt. My father reminded me of sacrifices, my mother reminded me of appearances, and Brooke asked if we were done because she had an early fitting. I cleared my plate, stood, and thanked my mother for dinner, which startled her more than a speech would have. On my way out, my father said my name the way people say the word bridge when they want to burn it behind them. I nodded, stepped into the night air that smelled like leaves and the secondhand smoke from a neighbor's porch, and texted the one person I trusted to read what I couldn't bear to look at any longer. The blue folder waited where I'd left it, a quiet wait on the top shelf of my closet full of papers I'd signed years ago at my father's desk, when it seemed easier to keep the peace than to ask the right questions. I set it on the kitchen counter, ran a thumb along the edge, and felt that same invisible click again. There are moments when a house shifts on its foundation before anyone hears the crack in the wall. There are moments when a life does the same. I didn't open it yet. I just turned off the overhead light, let the city glow take over the room, and listened to the steady hum that had followed me from office to home to this exact place where everything would begin to make sense. I didn't open the blue folder that night. I left it sitting on the counter while I brushed my teeth, washed my face, and tried to convince myself that sleep would come if I pretended hard enough. But every time I closed my eyes, I saw Brooke's smile across the dinner table, and my father's hand pressed against the stem of his wine glass the way he'd said family obligations like it was a rule carved into stone. When I finally gave up on rest, the city was still awake outside my window, its light crawling along the edge of the curtain like a quiet reminder that I wasn't alone in my unrest. The next morning I went to work as if nothing had happened. That's what years of practice will do. You learn to compartmentalize, to fold the chaos neatly and leave it on the doorstep. At Larkspur Capital, the air always smelled faintly of espresso and printer ink, the soundtrack a steady rhythm of typing and market chatter. I had 3 meetings, 2 calls with overseas clients, and a performance review to deliver. My assistant Claire slid a folder onto my desk. "Your father's assistant called again," she said. "She wanted to confirm your RSVP for the foundation gala." I thanked her and moved on, though the mention of his name felt like a stone dropped in a still pond. By late afternoon, I'd almost convinced myself that dinner had been a bad dream until an email came through from a Brooke Lawson events team. The subject line read, "Wedding Invoice Confirmation, Harper Lawson, Payment Authorization." My pulse ticked up as I opened the attachment. It was a spreadsheet filled with line items that looked more like a corporate budget than a celebration florals venue, deposits, designer fittings, catering minimums. Every cell beside the costs was already labeled paid by Harper Lawson. At the bottom in neat font were the words, "Remaining balance, $275,000. Due in 30 days. My first instinct was disbelief. My second was calculation. There was no way Brooke had access to any of my accounts, but the wedding planner's note included a forwarded message confirming my approval. The signature wasn't mine, it was forged cleanly and confidently. That was the moment the fog cleared. This wasn't just entitlement anymore. This was premeditated. That night, my parents called. My mother's voice came first, soft and familiar. "Honey, we didn't mean to upset you. Brooke's feeling so much pressure. It would mean the world if we could count on you for this." In the background, my father added, "You make 7 figures. Harper, you can afford to show generosity." I didn't argue. I simply said I'll think about it and ended the call before they could interpret my tone. Then I dialed Michael Carr. He picked up on the second ring, his voice still alert, even though it was close to midnight. "Harper, what's wrong?" I told him everything. The dinner, the forged documents, the folder I'd signed years ago at my father's desk. "Pull every record you can find on the Westchester property," I said. "Title deed, taxes, transfers, all of it." Michael didn't ask why. He just said, "Give me 2 hours." While he worked, I poured a glass of wine and sat on the couch with that blue folder in front of me. I traced the corner with my finger, remembering the night it first appeared. I'd been 25 then, just promoted exhausted from a week-long merger. My father had called me into his study, the one with the heavy drapes and the smell of leather polish, saying he needed my signature on estate planning documents. I remember the yellow sticky notes he'd placed, where I should sign the way he'd filled in everything else himself. "You trust your father, don't you?" he'd asked when I tried to slow down. I'd signed, eager to please. When Michael's email came through, I opened it before I could hesitate. The first document was a property deed dated December 12, 2016. Buyer Harper Lawson. Seller Thomas Lawson. Purchase price $4,200,000. My breath caught. Michael. I said when I called him back I never bought that house. He paused before answering. According to the record you did. Your father transferred ownership to you, took the money, and cleared his debts. You've been paying property taxes ever since, automatically from your accounts. For a long moment I couldn't speak. The silence between us stretched thin until Michael added quietly, "Harper, you own that house. It's legally yours. 8 years. 8 years of mortgage-free living for them all under my name, all funded by the daughter they called selfish." My mind spun backward through every holiday I'd spent in that house, every dinner where my father had toasted family legacy, every time I'd written a check, because it was easier than explaining why I didn't want to. I asked Michael to calculate what they owed in back rent, even though the number itself no longer mattered. It was the principle, the quiet truth sitting beneath the noise. $4,000 a month conservatively, he said. That's roughly $380,000 in unpaid rent. I told him to prepare an eviction notice. 30 days, I said. I want it served properly. The next day, I met with Walter Grant at a cafe near Bryant Park. He had been more than a mentor. He'd become the voice in my head that reminded me not to trade respect for approval. I told him what I'd found. He listened without interruption, his hands folded over his coffee. "You've been giving them pieces of yourself for years," he said finally. "Now you hold something they can't spin. Use it wisely." He looked at me over the rim of his glasses. "And whatever you do, don't lose your composure. People like your father count on your restraint to protect their image. Make the truth do the work for you." By the weekend, word had started spreading in the family. Brooke sent a group text to our relatives photos of her wedding venue messages laced with accusation. Harper makes millions, but won't help her only sister. A few aunts called their voices full of disappointment I no longer took personally. Your mother's heartbroken one said, "Your father says you've forgotten what family means." I thanked them for the concern and hung up. The guilt they were trying to deliver no longer fit me. I spent that Sunday in my office, the skyline burning gold against the glass. Michael called again with a strange note in his voice. "You've been invited to speak at the Hudson Ridge Foundation Gala," he said. "Your father's the chairman, right?" I leaned back in my chair. "Yes." "Why?" He hesitated. "Because your name's listed as their keynote speaker representing the next generation of financial leadership." I almost laughed. My father's organization had sent me an invitation to the event where he would soon lose everything. "Will you attend?" Michael asked. "Absolutely," I said. That night, I stood in front of my closet choosing a navy suit that felt more armor than attire. I thought about how many years I'd spent earning a seat at tables where men like my father already assumed they belonged. Now I had a new table in mind, one with cameras, board members, and the truth projected on a screen tall enough for everyone to see. The decision didn't come with anger, only clarity. Every story has its point of no return the moment you stop hoping for understanding and start acting on what's real. For me, it was the sound of my father's voice at dinner, calling my obligation a privilege. I finally understood that in his version of family loyalty only flowed one way. As I locked my office for the night, I could feel the week ahead aligning like chess pieces on a board. The eviction notice would be ready within days. The gala would follow soon after. For once, I didn't need to imagine revenge or vindication. I only needed to show up and let the truth do what it always does when it's been buried too long, rise quietly, and then burn. I didn't sleep much that week either, but it wasn't from restlessness anymore. It was the kind of wakefulness that comes when the weight begins to shift from your shoulders to theirs, and you know the next move is already in motion. The following week, the quiet I'd been clinging to shattered. It started with my phone lighting up at dawn, a long group text from Brooke sent to our entire extended family. The photos came first smiling shots of her and her fiancé outside a marble-columned venue captioned, "Can't wait for the wedding of the year." Then came the paragraph underneath. "It breaks my heart that Harper refuses to help. I guess some people forget family when they have money." Within minutes, my aunts and cousins filled the thread with pitying emojis and polite outrage. I scrolled through it twice, not out of shock, but to measure how far she was willing to go. By lunchtime, the phone calls began. "Your mother's sick over this," Aunt Diane said. "Your father hasn't slept in days. Can't you just write the check and move on?" Their words landed with a dull thud. I'd heard them all before, phrases that carried weight only if you still believed that peace was the same thing as surrender. That night, my voicemail was full. My mother's messages came one after another, her tone shifting from wounded to pleading. "Honey, your father's blood pressure is through the roof. The doctor says it's stress. Please don't let this destroy the family." The last one ended with her crying softly, the sound fading, as if she'd put her hand over the phone. I let them sit unheard a second time. Some part of me had finally stopped reacting the way they expected. Thomas tried a different tactic. The next morning, I received a formal letter printed on the Hudson Ridge Foundation stationery, complete with his signature at the bottom. The tone was almost corporate phrases, like shared responsibility and mutual contribution to family legacy. It read less like a father's request and more like a contract written under threat. When I reached the final line, I realized he'd CC'd their attorney. I forwarded the letter to Michael with a short note, "Add this to the file." His reply came back minutes later. "Already done. I'll make sure every exchange is logged." The tension grew by the day. My parents kept their silence in public, but their allies carried the message for them. A family friend called to tell me Thomas had been disappointed at the club that people were whispering about the rift. I listened, thanked him for his concern, and hung up. Gossip had always been their weapon of choice. This time I let it dull itself against the truth. 2 days later, Brooke crossed the line. My assistant Claire knocked on my office door holding an envelope marked urgent. "It came by courier," she said, setting it on my desk. Inside was an invoice official letterhead payment due within 48 hours. The signature at the bottom looked like mine, neat and practiced. I stared at it for a long moment before passing it to Claire. "It's a forgery," I said. Her eyes widened. "Do you want me to call the vendor?" "No," I replied. "Send it to Michael. He'll handle it." An hour later, the wedding planner herself called. "Miss Lawson, I just wanted to confirm you approved the upgraded floral package and additional photo team." I kept my voice steady. "No, I did not. Please forward all communications to my attorney. You are not authorized to charge anything in my name." She hesitated. "Your sister said I know what she said." "You have my statement. That will be all." That evening, a text from Brooke arrived, short and sharp. "You're going to ruin everything like you always do. Even his family thinks you're pathetic." I didn't answer. I forwarded it to Michael. Within minutes, he texted back, "This counts as harassment. I'll document it." By the end of the week, my phone had become a timeline of their unraveling, a gallery of accusations, guilt, and threats, all carefully preserved in digital ink. Meanwhile, Michael and I worked quietly. Every night, he called to review the files, the deed, the tax payments, the forged contracts, the bank transfers. We organized everything into labeled folders, preparing for what would come next. On Thursday afternoon, Caroline Wu, the Foundation's event coordinator, called my office. "Lawson," she said brightly, "we're confirming your attendance and speech for the gala next Friday at the Plaza. Your father's thrilled you're joining us." I leaned back in my chair. "Of course," I said. "Please send me the final program." When the email arrived, I opened the attachment and smiled. There it was, printed in elegant serif font, keynote speaker, Harper Lawson, managing partner, Larkspur Capital, leadership and legacy. That night, I met Walter Grant for dinner near Columbus Circle. He listened as I told him about the invitations, the forgery, the escalating campaign of guilt. The waiter poured his whiskey, and he took a slow sip before speaking. "They've built their identity around your obedience," he said. "You're rewriting the story, and they're terrified. Keep your focus. The truth will do the rest. I nodded, though part of me still felt the sting of recognition in his words. By Sunday, the plan was set. Michael had finished the portfolio we'd been building, thick with documentation stamped and cross-referenced. Every page told the same story in different numbers: the sale, the debt, the theft. He placed it on my conference table and said, "This could ruin them." I looked through the first few pages before closing the cover. "I don't want ruin," I said quietly. "I want the truth." The following morning, I drove past the old house for the first time in months. The lawn was manicured, the shutters freshly painted, as if the facade could hide what it was built on. Through the front window, I saw my mother adjusting a vase of flowers, her movements slow and deliberate. A moving van idled in the driveway next door, and for a moment I imagined how easily the scene could change: one signature, one delivery, one public reveal. That evening, my father sent one final email family meeting. Tomorrow. No excuses. The message came without a greeting, just an attached file labeled proposal.pdf. I didn't open it. I already knew what it contained. When I arrived the next night, the dining room looked staged the same way it had the night of the wedding ultimatum. The silverware gleamed, the candles were lit, and a stack of folders sat at my father's place setting. Brooke was already there, scrolling through her phone, her engagement ring catching the light. My mother smiled, but her eyes were tired. "Let's discuss this like adults." My father began tapping his tablet to project a slideshow onto the wall. The first slide read, "Family Contributions, 2009 to 2024. Charts and figures filled the screen, a parade of red and green bars, showing who had invested the most. "You make 7 figures, Harper," he said, turning toward me. "It's time you acted like it." I looked around the table at Brooke's carefully crossed arms, at my mother's anxious hands folded in her lap, and understood they'd rehearsed this. "And if I say no," I asked. My father's jaw tightened. "Then you're no longer part of this family." For a heartbeat, no one spoke. The only sound was the hum of the projector and the faint ticking of the clock in the hall. Then I reached for my coat. "I'll let you know tomorrow," I said. Brooke scoffed. "It's not that complicated, Harper. You either care about your family or you don't." I walked toward the door without answering. My father's voice followed me. 24 hours, he said. "After that, consider yourself a stranger." Outside, the air was cold and sharp, the kind that makes everything feel cleaner than it really is. I sat in my car for a long time before starting the engine. My reflection in the rearview mirror looked calm, but underneath it was something else, a steady certainty that whatever happened next would change everything. When I got home, I forwarded the recorded conversation to Michael and attached a short message. "It's time." Then I reached for my phone and called Walter. "I'm done playing defense," I said when he answered. "Good," he replied. "Then let's make sure the truth has the microphone." As I hung up, I looked again at the folder waiting on my desk, the deed, the contracts, the proof of 8 years' deceit. The gala was less than 2 weeks away. The stage was already built. They just didn't know who the spotlight would favor this time. I didn't answer my father's ultimatum. There was nothing to discuss. The moment I stepped out of that house, the air felt different, cooler, thinner, as if the years of obligation had lifted off my shoulders all at once. When I got home, I set my phone face down on the counter and opened the folder Michael had sent over earlier that day. Inside was a tidy stack of everything we'd been compiling for weeks: deeds, wire confirmations, scanned tax statements. Each document was a breadcrumb leading to the truth I'd been too busy to see. The deed was right there, stamped with the county seal, my name printed in black ink, as the sole owner of the Westchester property. Underneath the payment record showed transfers made from my accounts amounts I'd thought were investment contributions for the foundation. It turned out those family investments were the house itself. Thomas had sold it to me under the guise of tax optimization, taken the proceeds, and used them to pay off his debts. I had paid property taxes and insurance premiums for 8 years without realizing I was maintaining their roof, not ours. Michael's note at the bottom of the file was short and precise. "You are the legal owner. The sale is binding. All records verified." I sat there for a while, the city hum filling the silence, until the reality settled like a stone in my chest. Every dinner, every demand, every guilt-laced favor, they'd all happened inside my house. The next morning, Michael called. "Everything's airtight," he said. "You can move whenever you're ready." I asked him to draw up a formal eviction notice, 30 days to vacate, no extensions. His pause on the other end said what he didn't have to. "They're still your parents," he murmured. "I know," I answered. "That's why I'm giving them 30 days instead of 15. That evening, Walter stopped by my office unannounced. He was carrying 2 cups of coffee and that quiet steadiness that always made me listen. So he said, settling across from me, "What's next?" I told him about the deed, the eviction, the upcoming foundation gala. He smiled faintly, not from amusement, but from understanding. "They've been building this story for decades," he said. "You don't have to shout to break it, just tell the truth in a room that matters." I spent the next several nights preparing. Michael and I went through every page of documentation until the pile looked like a courtroom exhibit. He organized it into labeled binders, ownership payments, tax records, forged contracts. Each binder was identical in size and color, lined neatly inside a leather case. "You could dismantle them with this," he said as we finished. "Not just embarrass, dismantle." I closed the lid carefully. "I'm not looking to destroy them," I said. "I just want it on record who did what." By the time the foundation's gala approached, the pressure from my family had shifted into overdrive. Brooke posted a photo of herself standing in front of a boutique window filled with bridal gowns, captioned, "Can't wait for the best night of our lives, thanks to family support." The comments were a mix of congratulations and confusion, with one of my cousins tagging me directly. My mother left me 2 voicemails that day, one pleading, one angry. My father sent an email marked urgent accusing me of jeopardizing their reputation. I read each one once and then moved them into a folder marked evidence. On the Tuesday before the gala, Michael called again. "Your father's foundation finalized the seating chart," he said. "You're at the head table with him, your mother, and Brooke." I laughed quietly. Of course I am. The irony wasn't lost on either of us. The gala invitation arrived by courier that afternoon, cream paper embossed with gold lettering. Hudson Ridge Foundation, Annual Charity Gala, Family Values Building Generational Wealth and Wisdom. I set it beside the eviction notice, waiting for signatures. The timing couldn't have been more poetic. 2 nights later, I stood in front of my closet staring at a line of evening gowns. I chose a black one, simple, elegant nothing that would draw attention away from the moment itself. As I zipped it up, I caught my reflection in the mirror. I didn't look angry. I looked certain. The day of the event. The plaza's ballroom shimmered like something out of an old film. Crystal chandeliers, gold-rimmed glasses, music drifting over polished marble. Every seat was filled with someone who mattered in my father's world: board members, donors, local officials. He moved through the crowd like a politician greeting people by name, his laughter carrying just far enough to sound genuine. Brooke followed close behind him, her gown sparkling under the lights, a glass of champagne in hand. When I arrived, the conversation at the entrance paused for half a beat before resuming. A few people I recognized from the finance circuit nodded politely. My father turned surprise, flickering across his face before he covered it with a smile. "Harper," he said, offering his arm. "You made it. I wouldn't miss it," I said. He introduced me to a senator, a real estate developer, and 2 major donors, all while describing me as his daughter who works in finance. When one of them mentioned Larkspur Capital and how much they admired our work in emerging markets, his smile stiffened just slightly. During dinner, the conversation swirled around us: stocks, politics, vacation homes. Brooke leaned into her fiancé, whispering jokes she knew I could hear. My mother kept her tone light, asking about my schedule, my workload, pretending the last month hadn't happened. I answered politely, every word measured. When dessert plates were cleared, Caroline Wu approached the stage. "Thank you all for being here tonight," she said into the microphone. "To begin our program, we'll hear from our chairman, Mr. Thomas Lawson." The room quieted as he walked to the podium. His speech began like all his others: humble roots, hard work, and the importance of family. He spoke about generosity, about passing on values, about how success meant nothing without loved ones to share it with. Each phrase was polished, practiced, and utterly detached from the truth. He gestured toward our table. "My daughter Brooke understands these lessons well," he said proudly. "She's about to begin a new chapter and our family couldn't be happier. Her sister Harper has been so successful, and I'm proud she's here tonight to share in our joy." Applause filled the room. Then he smiled and delivered the line I'd been waiting for. In fact, he said, "We're thrilled to announce that Brooke's wedding will be hosted right here at the Plaza this New Year's Eve, a celebration of family unity and love funded by family values." The room erupted in polite cheers, flashes from cameras bouncing across the crystal walls. Brooke stood and waved, basking in it. My mother dabbed at her eyes with a napkin. My father's grin widened, confident the image was complete. When the applause finally faded, Caroline returned to the microphone. "And now," she said, "please welcome our special guest speaker, Harper Lawson, managing partner at Larkspur Capital, to share her thoughts on leadership and legacy." I rose from my chair and felt every pair of eyes in the room follow me. My father looked up, his expression freezing for a second before he forced another smile. I walked to the stage, the sound of my heels echoing softly on the marble. As I reached the podium, the screen behind me flickered to life, Michael's work waiting on cue. "Thank you," I began, scanning the faces before me. "Tonight we're here to talk about legacy, about what we build and what we choose to pass down." My father leaned forward slightly, unsure where I was going. 8 years ago, I continued, I signed what I believed were routine estate documents at my father's request. What I actually signed was a transfer of ownership for the property at 47 Westfield Lane, the home my parents have lived in since that day. A murmur spread through the audience as the deed appeared on the screen, complete with signatures and county seals. For 8 years, I said they have lived in my house while using my income to maintain their lifestyle. My father's face drained of color. My mother's hand gripped her napkin so tightly it tore. Brooke's jaw dropped. The cameras in the back began to swivel toward them. I turned another page of my notes, though I didn't need to look. "This isn't about money," I said steadily. "It's about truth and the difference between generosity and exploitation." The audience was silent now, every breath suspended in the space between disbelief and recognition. Behind me, Michael signaled to the staff handling the presentation. The next slide appeared proof of payments, taxes, forged contracts. "These are all public records," I said, "filed legally, witnessed properly, and verified by counsel." At the edge of the stage, I caught sight of Michael standing near the ballroom doors, a folded envelope in hand. 30 days' notice ready to deliver. When I finished, the applause didn't come immediately. It arrived like a wave, quiet at first, then building until it filled the room. I nodded once, stepped down, and walked toward my family's table. "Mr. Lawson," Michael said, his voice firm but respectful. "You've been served." He placed the envelope gently on the linen beside my father's plate. The cameras flashed again. My father's hand trembled as he stared at it. My mother whispered his name. Brooke pushed back her chair and stood abruptly, her voice breaking the silence. "You can't do this here," she hissed. I looked at her, calm and certain. "It's already done." Around us, the murmurs began to swell again, the sound of a reputation collapsing in real time. I turned and walked toward the exit, the cool air from the open doors brushing against my skin as I stepped into the hallway. The echo of voices followed behind me, blending with the faint hum of the city beyond the glass. The truth was finally out, and there was no taking it back. What waited next wasn't revenge, it was consequence. And by the end of that night, everyone in that ballroom would understand the difference. By the time I stepped out of the plaza that night, I could already feel the energy shifting. Inside the ballroom, the applause had turned into a low, confused hum. Outside, the air felt strangely light. The sound of New York traffic blended with faint laughter from guests trying to recover their composure. I walked toward the curb, handed my valet ticket to the attendant, and waited under the gold awning while my phone vibrated in my clutch. Notifications rolled across the screen, messages, missed calls, news alerts. The truth had already started to move faster than I ever could. The first article appeared before I even got home. Charity chairman's daughter reveals 8-year property deception at gala. It included photos from the event, a still of my father standing beside the foundation's banner, and another of Michael placing the envelope on the table. By morning, the story was everywhere: finance blogs, local news outlets, even a few national feeds. The footage from the Foundation's live stream had been clipped, shared, and replayed more times than I could count. At 7:00 a.m., my office phone rang. Claire's voice was calm but tight. "We're getting media requests," she said. "Every outlet wants a statement." I told her to decline them all. The documents spoke for themselves. I didn't need to add a single word. Later that morning, Michael called with updates. "The board is holding an emergency session this afternoon," he said. "They're moving to suspend your father pending an internal audit." I nodded, though he couldn't see it. "And Brooke?" I asked. He exhaled. "The wedding planners pulled out. The venue has too. They cited fraudulent contracts and unpaid balances. It's unraveling fast." By noon, my mother left a string of voicemails pleading, blaming, crying, then apologizing, all within an hour. Each one sounded smaller than the last. My father's silence, on the other hand, was louder than anything she could say. He hadn't reached out, but the headlines had already said enough. That afternoon, Walter stopped by my office. He dropped the newspaper on my desk, the headline stretching across the fold. "It's done," he said quietly. I met his eyes. "No," I replied. "It's beginning." Over the next 48 hours, the consequences unfolded with clinical precision. The Hudson Ridge Foundation issued a formal statement. Thomas Lawson has been placed on indefinite leave, pending an audit of all financial activity during his tenure. Several board members resigned on the spot, unwilling to weather the scandal. Donors withdrew support, citing ethical concerns. The country club suspended his membership pending review. Brooke's world collapsed in parallel. The Rainbow Terrace, her dream venue, canceled the contract and kept the deposit. The florist, photographer, and band followed within hours. The dressmaker sent a formal cancellation letter after seeing her name in the news. Even her fiancé's parents issued a statement through their attorney severing ties. I didn't hear about it from Brooke directly. I saw it on the news ticker while drinking coffee at my desk. For a while, I didn't feel vindication or sadness, just quiet. The kind of silence that comes when noise has finally burned itself out. Then came the flood of messages. Old classmates, colleagues, even strangers reached out. Some offered sympathy, others admiration. A few told their own stories about families who'd taken advantage of them. It was strange reading words like courageous and inspiring attached to something that still felt raw and unfinished. The following week, Michael called again. "The IRS has opened a review into your father's filings," he said. "It's standard when something like this goes public." I nodded, gripping the phone tighter. "And the eviction—" He paused. "They've requested mediation. Their attorney wants to negotiate." We met 3 days later in Michael's conference room. My parents sat across from me, looking older than I'd ever seen them. My father's confidence was gone, replaced by fatigue. My mother's eyes were red, her hands folded neatly in her lap as though she were holding something fragile. Their lawyer spoke first, suggesting they remain in the house under new terms: reduced rent, extended time, mutual non-disclosure. Michael declined before I could answer. "This isn't a negotiation," he said evenly. My father's voice cracked when he finally spoke. "Harper, you've humiliated us." I met his gaze. "No," I said. "You humiliated yourselves. I just stopped protecting you from it." The agreement that followed was straightforward: 60 days to vacate, waived back rent, no further legal action if they complied. It was more mercy than they deserved, but I didn't want revenge. I wanted closure. They signed the papers in silence. When it was done, my mother reached for my hand, but I didn't take it. Not yet. A few days later, the Foundation's treasurer called to thank me. "You've saved us from a bigger scandal," he said. "The audit uncovered years of irregularities. Most of them trace back to your father's personal accounts." His voice was careful, professional, but the relief beneath it was unmistakable. "We'd like to offer you a position on the board," he added. I declined politely. "I don't want to rebuild what they broke," I said. "You'll find someone better for that." Meanwhile, Larkspur Capital thrived. Clients who'd watched the gala unfold began reaching out directly. They admired composure, professionalism, the ability to stand firm without theatrics. Within a week, we secured 3 new partnerships, totaling $70 million in investments. My team noticed the change, too. "You handled it with grace," one analyst told me. I just nodded. Some victories don't feel like triumph. They feel like exhaling after years of holding your breath. Still, my family wasn't finished trying. Brooke sent a barrage of messages through cousins and mutual friends. "You destroyed our lives," one read. "You always wanted to be the victim." Another came hours later. "I'll make sure people know who you really are." Michael sent a cease and desist letter the next morning. After that, she went silent. Weeks passed and life settled into a quieter rhythm. My father stayed out of public view while the foundation's audit continued. My mother was spotted once at a grocery store wearing sunglasses indoors. The tabloids moved on to fresher scandals. For the first time in years, my name wasn't connected to theirs. It stood on its own. Then one afternoon I received a call from Walter. "You've been invited to keynote the Women in Finance Summit next quarter," he said. "Topics: leadership through integrity. They're offering $50,000. I smiled faintly. "Seems appropriate timing," I replied. That evening I walked past the Westchester house. The windows glowed softly against the winter dusk. The garden still trimmed, the curtains drawn. For a moment, I wondered if they were inside packing boxes or avoiding each other in separate rooms. I didn't stop to find out. I just kept walking, the sound of gravel crunching under my shoes. By the end of February, the audit results became public. The Hudson Ridge Foundation released a detailed statement confirming misuse of funds and unreported assets. My father resigned officially the next day. The board thanked me privately for cooperation and courage. I accepted their gratitude, but it didn't feel like victory. It felt like the truth finally catching up. My mother sent a single text that night. "We're leaving Westchester next week. I hope someday you'll understand." I stared at the screen for a long time before replying. "I already do." After that, I didn't hear from them again for a while. The house stood quiet and still, waiting for its next chapter. The deed had always been in my name, but for the first time the space itself felt like it belonged to me. Still, I knew the story wasn't over. They would have to face the life they built on borrowed image, and I would have to decide what forgiveness would mean if it ever came. The only certainty was that the balance had finally shifted. The truth had done its work, and now it was time to see what would grow in the space it left behind. The days after my parents signed the mediation agreement felt strangely still. For 8 years, my life had been dictated by their demands, their emergencies, their expectations. Now there was only quiet, a kind that didn't rush to fill itself. On my desk sat the signed papers, crisp and final, the ink already dry. Michael had notarized every page. They had 60 days to vacate, no rent, owed, no criminal charges filed, and a clause that barred them from contacting me directly until they completed therapy. It was a clean line between then and now. The following week, Walter invited me to lunch at a quiet bistro near the park. The snow outside had just started to fall, the flakes melting as they hit the window. "How does it feel?" he asked, stirring his coffee. I thought for a moment before answering. "Like I've stepped out of a storm I didn't know I was standing in." He smiled, that patient, knowing look he always had when I finally caught up to what he already saw. That's what peace feels like, at first unnatural. At the same time, the headlines began to fade from front pages to the corners of finance columns. My father's resignation was made official. The foundation had appointed an interim chair and released a statement about commitment to transparency. My mother, who once lived for every gala and charity dinner, disappeared entirely from public life. Brooke had gone silent, at least publicly. Though Michael forwarded a message, her lawyer sent a signed acknowledgement of her involvement in the forged contracts, an agreement to cease all contact. I focused on work, the one constant that had always made sense. Larkspur Capital was in its strongest quarter yet. Clients appreciated stability, and somehow my name had come to represent that. A few new investors even mentioned the gala, how they admired the composure, how integrity mattered more than optics. Each comment reminded me of how far I'd come from the girl who'd once been afraid to say no. Still, the process of untangling from my family wasn't as simple as paperwork. Michael's team managed the property transfer logistics, but there were constant reminders that the Lawsons had once been at the center of everything. Movers called for access codes, contractors asked which furniture stayed. Every decision required my approval, every item another reminder of what had been taken for granted. In early December, I visited the house for the first time since the gala. The driveway was slick with ice, the hedges bare. Through the kitchen window, I could see boxes stacked neatly against the wall. My mother's touch was everywhere, labels written in her perfect cursive, fragile stickers, placed even on items that didn't need them. The movers nodded politely when I entered, their voices low. "They've been quiet," one said. "No trouble." I walked through each room, noting how familiar everything looked and how foreign it felt now. In my father's old study, the air still carried the faint scent of cologne and old paper. On the desk sat a single envelope addressed to me. Inside was a handwritten note. For what it's worth, I never meant for it to go this far. I just didn't know how to stop once it started. There was no apology, just exhaustion between the lines. I left it on the desk and told the movers to pack it with the rest. The next few weeks moved in small, deliberate steps. My parents' belongings were loaded into 3 trucks and sent to a new address in Yonkers, a modest rental apartment arranged by their lawyer. Michael confirmed the deposit had cleared from their remaining accounts. Brooke had moved in with them temporarily, according to the paperwork. The entire process took 8 hours. When it was over, I stood on the front porch of the house I technically owned, watching the last truck pull away. For the first time, the property felt like mine, not because a document said so, but because there was no one left claiming it as theirs. That night, I walked through the empty rooms. My heels clicked softly on the wood floors, echoing in spaces that had once been filled with constant noise arguments, demands, laughter that never quite reached the eyes. I found a family photo tucked behind the fireplace mantel taken years ago. We were standing in that same living room, smiling, the house bright with holiday lights. I slipped it into a box marked storage. Some memories, even the painful ones, didn't need to be destroyed. They just needed distance. By January, they were gone. The final inspection was complete, the keys handed over. Michael sent confirmation that the house was clear of all encumbrances and back taxes. "You're free," he said over the phone. "Completely." It was the first time I'd heard him sound lighter than I felt. Around that time, the Women in Finance Summit announced its keynote lineup. My name was listed between 2 Fortune 500 CEOs. The topic: leadership and boundaries. Walter called the next morning. "Seems fitting," he said. "They're finally recognizing what you've been doing all along." In the weeks leading up to the event, I worked with the organizers to refine my speech. Every draft returned to the same theme: how success means little if you allow guilt or obligation to control you. One night, while rehearsing at my apartment, I realized I wasn't just writing a keynote. I was writing the ending of something I'd been carrying since childhood. Then on a cold evening in February, Michael called again. "They'd like to meet," he said. "Your parents. They've completed the therapy requirement and submitted proof of attendance. 12 sessions signed by their therapist." I hesitated before answering. "Tell them I'll think about it." A week later, I agreed. The meeting would be brief, in a public place, a neutral coffee shop in White Plains. When I arrived, they were already there, sitting side by side at a corner table. My father's hair had gone almost entirely gray, and my mother looked smaller, somehow, her posture less polished. The first few minutes passed quietly. Then she spoke. "We wanted to thank you for giving us time. We've learned things we should have seen long ago." My father nodded, his hands clasped together on the table. "I was blind to what I was doing," he said, "to what I made you carry." For a moment, none of us spoke. The noise of the cafe filled the Gap coffee cups, clinking low conversation around us. I asked how they were adjusting. My father said he'd taken consulting work for a small firm. My mother was working part-time at a boutique. They looked human, not the curated version they'd always tried to be. We talked for exactly an hour. They didn't ask for money, didn't make excuses, didn't deflect. When the time was up, I thanked them for coming and stood to leave. My mother reached for my hand, tentative this time. "We know it will take time," she said, "but we want to earn back what we lost." I nodded. "That's not something you can buy," I said, "but it's a start." Outside, the air was cool and still. I walked to my car without looking back, the weight of old habits lifting with each step. The next morning, a letter arrived at my office. No legal letterhead, no signatures, just a plain envelope addressed in my mother's handwriting. Inside was a single page. It wasn't the formal apology required by the agreement, but a personal one. She wrote about understanding now what love without respect becomes, about how silence and entitlement had been her way of surviving my father's pride. It was the first honest thing she'd ever given me. I read it twice, folded it neatly, and placed it in the same folder that once held the deed. For the first time, the word family no longer felt like a debt waiting to be collected. It felt like a lesson that had finally reached its end. Outside my window, snow began to fall again, soft and steady against the city skyline. There was no grand victory, no celebration, just a quiet shift, the kind that signals something real has changed. What came next wouldn't be about exposure or justice anymore. It would be about rebuilding on my terms, this time in my house, with my own peace intact. The first sign that everything was finally settling came on a quiet Sunday morning in March. I was standing by the window of my apartment, coffee in hand, watching the last traces of winter melt from the rooftops. The city sounded different now, less like a demand, more like a rhythm. My calendar was full, but my mind wasn't. For the first time in years, there was space for stillness. Work at Larkspur had entered a new season. Our firm had just crossed a major milestone, $1 billion in managed assets. The press release included my name, and within days I was flooded with messages from women in finance who'd followed my story after the gala. Some wrote about setting boundaries with their families, others about walking away from old patterns. It was humbling to realize how far truth could travel once you stopped hiding it. The Women in Finance Summit took place a week later. The event filled an entire ballroom at the Waldorf, packed with executives, investors, and young analysts just starting out. When I stepped up to the podium, I wasn't nervous this time. The words came easily grounded and deliberate. I spoke about integrity, about how leadership wasn't just what you built, but what you refused to sacrifice to get there. The applause that followed was warm, not loud, not performative, just genuine. It felt like the first honest applause of my life. Afterward, Walter found me backstage smiling as if he'd known this outcome all along. "You've turned survival into strategy," he said. I laughed softly. "You make it sound cleaner than it was." He shook his head. "Clean doesn't mean easy. You did the hard part, choosing peace when chaos was familiar." The next day, I received a call from a woman named Rachel Myers, a journalist from Fortune. She wanted to feature me in an article about resilience and financial ethics. I hesitated at first. Public attention had already caused enough damage, but Rachel was patient. "It's not about scandal," she said. "It's about what happens after." We met for coffee later that week. She asked about my work, the lawsuit, the house. Her questions were steady and respectful, never sensational. When the article went live, the headline read, "From Family Fallout to Financial Leadership, Harper Lawson redefines success." It spread quietly, the way truth often does when it's handled with care. Within a month, Larkspur's client list grew by nearly a third. Several of my peers sent congratulations. Even my team at the firm surprised me with a small celebration. A card, a bottle of champagne, and a handwritten note that simply said, "You earned your peace." Around that time, Michael called with an update. "The audit's been closed," he said. "No criminal charges." They complied with the terms completely. I exhaled, realizing I'd been waiting for those words more than I'd admitted. "They've moved out permanently," he continued. The keys were returned through their attorney. A few days later, I drove to Westchester to check on the house. The property was quiet, the front gate locked, the garden overgrown from weeks of neglect. I walked through each room slowly. The echoes had changed. They no longer sounded like arguments or expectations, just open air and possibility. Sunlight spilled across the hardwood, catching dust motes in soft patterns. It was strange standing in a place that had once been the backdrop for every version of who I'd been. The dutiful daughter, the invisible provider, the one always asked to fix what others broke. Now it was simply space. By spring, renovations began. I hired a small team to repaint, replace fixtures, and refinish the floors. Each choice felt deliberate: oak instead of mahogany, white walls instead of deep beige. I wanted light, not legacy. One afternoon, while sorting through a storage box, I found my mother's old piano. The keys were yellowed, the bench scratched, but it still played softly when I pressed the middle C. I asked the movers to place it by the window in the front room. Walter stopped by during one of the renovation days. He leaned against the doorway watching the workers install new shelves. "So this is what reclaiming looks like," he said. "Feels different than revenge, doesn't it?" I smiled. "It feels like breathing." By April, the foundation reached out with an unexpected request. Their new board wanted to establish a scholarship in my name funded by anonymous donors who admired the stance I'd taken. The Harper Lawson Fellowship for Ethical Finance. It sounded surreal, but I accepted on one condition, that half the recipients come from first-generation college backgrounds. The board agreed unanimously. The launch ceremony took place in early May. It wasn't grand, just a small gathering at the university's business school. I met the first scholarship recipient, a young woman named Ava Hernandez, who reminded me of myself at 22, sharp, soft-spoken, determined to make her own way. She hugged me after the ceremony and whispered, "Thank you for proving we can walk away and still win." I didn't know what to say, so I just squeezed her hand. Meanwhile, Brooke's name resurfaced briefly in an industry notice. She'd been let go from her marketing position for unprofessional conduct. It didn't surprise me, though it did make me pause. Michael mentioned she was attending counseling and had paid restitution for the forged invoices. "She's keeping a low profile," he said. I nodded, unsure what I felt: relief, pity, maybe both. My parents remained in Yonkers, living quietly. Every few weeks, a check for therapy costs arrived from them, as outlined in our agreement. They never missed one. Sometimes a handwritten note came with it. The messages were short. "We're still learning," or "Thank you for the chance to do better." I didn't always respond, but I kept every note. In late May, Fortune invited me to their annual leadership gala, this time as an honoree. The event felt full circle a year after the night that had broken everything. I was back in a ballroom, but on my own terms. As I stood under the lights, the host introduced me not as someone's daughter, but as a leader who'd turned integrity into a compass for others to follow. When I walked off stage, Walter met me at the bottom of the stairs, clapping softly. "You did it," he said. "Not for them, for you." I smiled. For the first time, that's enough. After the gala, I went home to Westchester. The house was finally finished, bright, simple, and quiet. The garden had begun to bloom again, hydrangeas and lilies replacing the roses my mother once favored. I stood on the back patio, looking out at the yard as dusk settled over the trees. That night, I hosted my first dinner there, not for family, but for friends, colleagues, and a few mentors who'd stood beside me through everything. The laughter was easy, the air filled with the scent of rosemary and lemon from the kitchen. It felt like what home was always meant to be, a place of peace, not proof. When the guests left, I stayed outside barefoot on the cool stone, listening to the faint hum of crickets beyond the fence. The stars were faint but steady, the kind you only noticed when the noise finally stopped. I thought about the long arc that had led me here, years of silence, of carrying what wasn't mine to carry, and realized that justice hadn't been a single moment at the plaza. It had been every quiet choice that followed. I locked the doors, turned off the lights, and paused at the piano before heading upstairs. My reflection in the window looked calm, almost unrecognizable from the woman I'd once been. Tomorrow, the world would move on again, as it always did. But tonight, peace felt like enough. And somewhere beneath all that quiet, the future waited steady open, and finally, my own. The house in Westchester felt different by summer. The air inside carried the scent of new paint and lemon polish, and the faint echo of laughter from the dinners I'd begun hosting with people who truly felt like family. Each week, the space filled with warmth instead of expectation, with stories told freely instead of carefully measured silences. For the first time in my life, the walls didn't hold secrets, they held peace. I walked through the rooms one quiet morning, sunlight spilling across the floors, and thought about how much had changed in a single year. The study that once belonged to my father now held my library lined with books on leadership, finance, and self-worth. The dining room where I had once been cornered into obligations I couldn't refuse now echoed with laughter from friends and colleagues who treated one another as equals. The kitchen window framed the garden where the hydrangeas bloomed again after years of neglect. It was hard to believe the same ground had once been a battlefield. My parents were still in Yonkers, rebuilding in small ways. Their therapy reports came regularly, signed by their counselor and sent through Michael's office. Each time a short note arrived with them, never excuses, just quiet acknowledgments. "We're learning," my mother wrote once. "We're trying to become people you wouldn't have to protect yourself from." I kept those letters in a small wooden box on my desk, not as proof of change, but as reminders that healing, even when slow, was still a choice. Brooke stayed away for months, until one afternoon a letter came addressed in her handwriting. It was brief, uncertain, almost fragile. She apologized not for the wedding or the money or the years of comparison, but for never seeing me as a person separate from the family's needs. "I thought love meant keeping up," she wrote. "I never realized how much it cost you until everything fell apart." There was no return address, just her signature at the bottom. I didn't reply right away. Some bridges need time before you test if they can hold weight again. Larkspur Capital thrived beyond anything I'd imagined. Our clients grew, our team expanded, and for once, success didn't feel like a mask. I had to wear it felt earned, honest, and peaceful. I spent more time mentoring young analysts, especially women, who were learning to find their voices in rooms that often tried to quiet them. Watching them grow reminded me of what Walter had told me years ago, that real success wasn't measured by applause, but by the integrity you kept when no one was watching. In June, I stood on the back patio with a glass of wine, watching the sunset stretch across the trees. The house glowed behind me, soft light spilling from every window. It struck me that I wasn't standing in the ruins of something broken anymore. I was standing in the foundation of something rebuilt, not out of guilt or obligation, but out of truth. The journey hadn't made me harder. It had made me certain. Later that evening, I sat at the piano by the front window, the same one my mother once played when we were children. I pressed a few keys slow and hesitant until a melody began to form. It wasn't perfect, neither was I, but it was real. Every note felt like reclaiming a piece of the silence I used to live under. The kind of silence that hides shame had turned into one that held peace. When I think back now, the most surprising part isn't how my family fell apart. It's how I finally stopped trying to keep it together at the expense of myself. Boundaries didn't end love. They revealed who was willing to meet me halfway. Forgiveness didn't mean forgetting. It meant I could walk through the same doors without carrying their weight anymore. The house was worth more now, both in value and meaning. But that wasn't what mattered most. Its real worth came from the laughter that filled it, the friends who gathered around my table, the quiet mornings where I could simply exist without defending my right to do so. Justice, I learned, isn't always loud. Sometimes it's the steady sound of your own life finally belonging to you. As the night settled in, I turned off the lights one by one, leaving the piano's soft hum fading into the dark. The garden lights glowed faintly outside, marking the path to the gate. The world was still moving, as it always would, but this time I wasn't chasing it. I was standing still, grounded, whole. Before heading upstairs, I paused at the window and looked out across the yard. Somewhere beyond the quiet, my parents were learning their own lessons. My sister was finding her way, and I, at last, had found mine. If you've ever had to choose peace over approval or truth over comfort, I hope my story reminds you that strength doesn't come from fighting harder, it comes from finally letting go. And if it does take a moment to share it with someone who needs that reminder tonight. Because sometimes the most powerful justice isn't revenge. At all, it's reclaiming your life and learning to live it freely.